I can remember hearing on the radio that this big announcement that the first Apollo crew had been killed in a fire on the pad. You know, when you're in space with a vacuum outside, you want the pressure of the inside the spacecraft to help hold the hatch closed. And so logically, the design was such that there was an outer hatch and an inner hatch, and that inner hatch was held against the seal around the open hatch by the pressure, so that to open up the hatch, you had to pull in the inner hatch first and then open up the outer hatch outward. But the terrible reality was that on the pad during the testing, which was of course going on Apollo 1 at the time, because of a fire inside, the pressure went up, and that held that inner hatch closed, and the guys couldn't open it. So this safety feature actually killed the guys.
You are about to embark upon the great crusade
to meet this mounting aggression.
And make no mistake about it, good will prevail.
I was born in a place called Neptune, New Jersey, on the Jersey Shore, and lived in a little, in fact, it wasn't even a town. I just lived in an area called Bailey's Corner, dirt road, that kind of thing when I was born and raised. My father had been in the Army at some point, I think in World War II. I don't know if he was drafted or joined, frankly, but he was in for just a relatively short time, I think in the Signal Corps or something like that. He didn't serve in any war, to my knowledge.
Why did you decide to join the Air Force?
Well, I mean, as a kid, I'd always been fascinated by airplanes. Where we lived in New Jersey on a farm, we were very near Lakehurst Naval Air Station, and this was, you know, basically when I was a young guy growing up, a young kid. You know, there were generally Navy fighter planes, but all kinds of fighter planes. So it was the beginning of World War II, so they were dogfighting, you know, over the farm all the time. I mean, so I saw all kinds of airplanes dogfighting from the time I was probably 5 or 6 years old until World War II ended in 45 or so. Yeah.
So you were fascinated pretty early.
Oh yeah, I knew all the airplanes, you know.
What were you flying when you joined?
Well, I mean, training was, in my era, was the T-34, I guess, and then the T-28. Then from T-28, I went into jet training with a T-33. Out of basic training, I went from there into the F-86. Williams Air Force Base in Arizona, we had F-86Fs for training. And then on active duty, the last part of training was in the F-100A at that time. And I went on in active duty to fighter squadron in the Philippine Islands, and we were flying F-100s, F-100Ds, and the two-seater, the F as well. The F-100D was a nuclear capable. We carried nukes, was our mission, fighter bomber type work, and we stood alert, not down in the Philippines, but our squadron would deploy up to Taiwan, and we had a couple of different bases up there, but in general we stood nuclear alert on Tainan Air Base on Taiwan, and that was you know, we would typically be there for each of the subunits out of the squadron would deploy up there like 1 week out of every 4 or something like that. 3 weeks out of every 4 we'd be back home at Clark. But we would deploy up there, and the planes would be sitting there at the end of the runway, and we'd, you know, every third or fourth day we'd have a day off in town, but most of the time we were sleeping out at the end of the runway, waiting for the whistle to blow and the code words to come down the telephone, and off we'd go and, you know, bomb somebody.
How did you get the opportunity to pursue astronaut training? How did that opportunity present itself to you, or how did you pursue it?
Well, after I finished my active duty in the Air Force in 1960, I went back to graduate school at MIT, but in order to make enough money to keep the family going, I also enlisted in the Mass Air Guard. So I was flying fighter planes, even though I was, out of the active duty Air Force. And I had always been interested in aircraft, as I already mentioned. And anytime you're a fighter pilot, I mean, you want to go faster and you want to go higher. You go faster and you go higher, eventually you get into space, right? And of course, again, my education was aeronautical engineering in undergraduate, but when I got out of the Air Force and went back to graduate school at MIT, by that time the department had shifted to the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics, because we had launched the first satellites and the first humans, actually, while I was active duty in the Air Force. And so it was very natural that my interest, and I hadn't mentioned yet, but I'd also been interested not only in the sort of engineering and physical part of being a fighter pilot, but also in astronomy. And so, again, becoming an astronomical object myself was a natural inclination.
And when a president says he wants to get to the moon in the next decade, that's
Hey,
about all the motivation.
That was a clarion call when Kennedy, made the announcement of the manned space program and the goal of getting to the moon. I mean, that was a major charge in my life and a commitment that I was joined by other people, but that was a very serious commitment that dealt not only with my ambition but also with a fundamental goal of the nation, largely out of having been embarrassed by the Soviet Union getting into space first.
So what criteria were they looking for? How did they select the best of the best from the people they brought in for training?
Well, that the whole selection process has morphed over the years. In the early days, and we were in the third group, the third selection of astronauts that was made in the end of '62 and the beginning of '63, and in that third selection, you became an astronaut. Later on, you became an astronaut candidate, and you went through a sort of filtering process inside NASA before you became an actual astronaut. But in the early days, if you were selected, you were an astronaut, you were going to fly. It was only a matter of how soon, which mission, and that kind of thing.
Tell me a little bit about the training they put you through as they got you closer and closer to being ready for missions.
Well, again, these things have morphed a bit over time, but at that time when we went in, all of us came from many different backgrounds. Some of us were in science and in education, had advanced degrees in science or whatever. Other people came from the test pilot school or things of that kind, so that there was a mix of backgrounds. And the first thing that NASA did was to conduct a kind of basic training, which essentially, mainly academic, but not entirely, which brought all of these people to a common goal. So that even though the guys who were test pilots didn't become the equivalent of a master's degree or a PhD if they were at a graduate school somewhere, nor did my experience in graduate school suddenly make me the training at NASA make me a test pilot. Nevertheless, it brought us all to a sort of basic minimum level of common experience and education. We all also went through survival training at that time. That was another part of the initial training. That lasted for probably a half a year to 3/4 of a year after we were selected as astronauts. And after that basic training period, each of us took some kind of a specialty. Some people the spacesuit, other people controls and displays that would be in our future spacecraft. In my case, one of the first things I did, again coming out of MIT, and in particular the laboratory I worked in was related to the MIT, at that time, Instrumentation Lab, later the Draper Lab, which developed the whole guidance and navigation system for the lunar module and the Apollo command module. And so because of my background at MIT, my assignment, one of my assignments at that time, was the guidance and navigation systems for Apollo. So each of us had a different type of background or specialty that we oversaw. But that was one of the things I did right after the basic training.
You were part of the backup crew for Apollo 1, which of course ended tragically in January of 1967. Gus Grissom, Roger Chaffee, and Ed White lost their lives. What can you tell us about that day and what that was like to be so near that?
Well, it was very interesting because, I mean, it's actually too much not only to try to tell you, but it's too much for me to even remember at my age all of the details back then. But there was a great deal of fluidity in the program, and our crew, which was Jim McDivitt, Dave Scott, and myself, were identified as a crew, and we were initially assigned as the backup crew for the first Apollo mission, the first manned Apollo mission. And the crew for that mission was, of course, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. And we were all friends. We lived near each other, you know, in the Houston area. And that was great, and it was the first time when Gus and I really got to like one another. He'd seen me as kind of a nerd, you know, up until that time, and Gus was an interesting, rather gruff sort of guy. But Gus and I got to be great friends at the time, and we worked very closely with them, but we were also seen sort of as the first crew that would probably fly the lunar module. We were backup to the first crew, but it was sort of understood that we would have the first lunar module mission. And then because of various changes that are too complex to go into, it turned out that the guys who were going to fly the second mission, which was Wally Schirra and his crew, became the backup crew to the first mission, and Jim McDivitt, our crew, moved to the third flight, which was going to be the first flight of the lunar module. So we were on our own, had our own mission at that time. We were the prime crew on the third mission, and I can remember I was literally in Los Angeles doing some work with Rockwell, or what was North American Aviation, became Rockwell, the prime contractor on the command module. And I was literally driving south on Sepulveda Boulevard, for those who are familiar with the LA area, right before it goes under the runways at LAX. And I was driving my rental car, I don't know, I was headed toward the hotel or something, but I can remember hearing on the radio that this big announcement that the first Apollo crew had been killed in a fire on the pad at Cape Kennedy. And I can remember the shock of hearing that. And just before I went underneath the runways, I pulled off to the right on Sepulveda Boulevard, and I just sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, listening to the radio and being totally in shock. I think I probably sat there for a half an hour before I could put the car back in gear and continue with the day. I mean, it was an incredible and instantaneous shock that I heard being announced to the public. Amazing. I think my response, and perhaps we always think everybody's response is like our own, but I think the primary response that most of the guys had was, my God, how could we not have anticipated that tragedy? I mean, the design of the command module hatch at that time was such that we call it the Block 1 command module was the design, and we ended up there was going to be a Block 2. We all knew that it had different characteristics, and the design difference between the Block 1 and Block 2 in terms of the command module hatch was that because you have when you're in space with a vacuum outside, you want the pressure of the inside the spacecraft to help hold the hatch closed. And so logically, the design was such that there was an outer hatch and an inner hatch, and that inner hatch was held against the seal around the open hatch by the pressure inside the spacecraft. It was sort of a safeguard, actually seen as a safety feature, so that to open up the hatch, you had to pull in the inner hatch first and then open up the outer hatch outward. But the terrible reality was that on the pad during the testing, which was of course going on Apollo 1 at the time, because of a fire started inside, the pressure went up, and that held that inner hatch closed, and the guys couldn't open it. So this safety feature actually killed the guys, and the question came up, how could we not have understood that was a possibility, and with the enriched atmosphere, 100% during the test, that we needed 100% in flight, so, you tested 100%. 100% oxygen and a hatch that was held against the seal, and you couldn't pull that in, that was a killer. And it was just a shock to realize that we had not understood the terrible consequence of any kind of a fire, anything that would raise the pressure inside of the spacecraft during testing. So that was the main thing. Of course, the next thing was, my God, here we are, I guess it was, 68, coming right up on the end of the decade, and Kennedy's commitment to get to the moon and return person from the moon by the end of the decade was racing up on us, and the question is, my God, are we going to miss that goal because of this, or can we get this repaired and fixed and redesigned and move on with it and still meet that goal? So that was the second issue. But the shock of those three guys being killed by that design and not really having paid proper attention to safety was a real shock to everybody.
All right, let's move on to Apollo 9 now.
Yeah.
And you talked about the importance of the lunar module, first and foremost, on this mission. What were you specifically testing or planning to test on the module?
Well, the primary purpose of the mission really was it was the initial flight of the lunar module. We would fly it in Earth orbit because for the first test flight, you want to check out as much as you can, but you don't want to do unnecessary risks, so you don't want to do the first flight out at the moon. So the mission was designed to fly 10 days in Earth orbit, and we would test everything about the lunar module that could be tested in Earth orbit. But there were a few things, like, for example, the most obvious thing, the landing radar, for example. You couldn't test that flying in orbit around the Earth. So there were some things that were left for an initial checkout on Apollo 10 before the first planned landing on Apollo 11. But everything about the fundamental characteristics of the spacecraft itself, maneuvering, all the engine testing, everything, probably 90% of the functionality of the lunar module could be tested in Earth orbit. And that was the primary set of objectives. But right behind that was the fact that the guys would be going out on the surface of the moon, collecting rocks and whatnot, And so we had the Apollo suit was different from the earlier Gemini suits, thank heaven, because the Gemini suit was really terrible, and it created a lot of problems with the EVA, extravehicular activity. But the Apollo suit was a new design which enabled you to, through convolutes at the major joints, the knees and the shoulders and the elbows, far more maneuverable suit, and I was the first one to do an EVA using the new Apollo suit. And that was a secondary objective, but it was right behind the primary objective of the testing and validation of the lunar module itself. So that was a great privilege for me to be, testing both of them.
I've also read how you were kind of mesmerized for a bit while you were out there looking back at the Earth. Talk about that moment a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, let me just talk about the planned EVA. I mean, I was testing for the first time the new Apollo suit, and so the primary objective of the EVA, which was planned to be about 2 hours, was in fact to test the suit itself. That was the main issue, and the backpack, which I had on, which made me, of course, independent of the spacecraft. For the first time, all EVAs up until that time, all through Gemini, you had umbilicals, hoses, which connected you to the environmental control system inside the spacecraft. And so that's an umbilical. But on Apollo, I didn't have an umbilical. I had just a simple tether, a rope. That was all. Okay? And the backpack provided my life support, and so I was an independent spacecraft, really, and all it was connecting me was a simple tether, which was a pain in the butt. By the way, let me just say, the safety tether created hazards, right? Because it's always flopping around and it'd hook over an antenna or over a thruster or something. You have to keep caring for the damn tether. But in any event, so the objective was to go outside, test the backpack and the suit. But in that process, because the next day we were going to be going out and separating the two spacecraft 100 miles and coming back in and doing a rendezvous to test the rendezvous procedures and the docking. The docking mechanism was a Rube Goldberg device. I mean, an extremely complicated device. A funnel, which was a drogue with a hole in the middle, and a probe which went into it, and it had all kinds of moving parts and springs and pressurization and little hooks. I mean, it was an amazing device that it ever worked. Actually, it never failed, but it was just amazing that it did. But flying it the first time, we recognized that that was a prime source of problems, that complex mechanism might not work, but we would have to get back into the command module or we couldn't come home and, re-enter and survive. So another objective during my EVA was to externally transfer from the lunar module out the front door and across a set of handrails to get into the command module so that we could come home in case that tunnel was screwed up or the probe and drogue messed up. So everything worked fine, the first part of the EVA, and I'm just starting that traverse up the front of the lunar module to get over to the command module, and Dave Scott over in the command module has got a movie camera. We didn't have any TV cameras in those days, right? So we had a movie camera, and the film camera jammed after I had gotten maybe 5 feet up the front of the handrail, up the front of the lunar module. And Dave says, "Oops, the camera just jammed." And Jim McDivitt says, "Okay, Rusty, stop. Dave, I'm going to give you 5 minutes to fix it. That's all time we can afford. Rusty, stay right there." Aye, aye, sir. Nothing like being unemployed in space, right? It was like, right, Jim, I'm not going to go anywhere. So instead of holding on to the handrail, like it was vertical in a sense, I let go with my right hand. First of all, in my head, I'm saying, okay, this 5 minutes is for me. Okay, I'm not going to start thinking about what comes next. I'm going to take these 5 minutes to really be here. So I let go with my right hand, just swung around with the left hand, and I mean, here is the Earth, the sun up there, the Earth over here, and I'm looking at the Earth horizon. You know, it's just absolutely spectacular, and it's completely quiet. I don't know what McDivitt was doing. Dave Scott was trying to fix the camera, and I'm just gaga looking around, and McDivitt was doing whatever he was doing. The radios only work when you're talking, when somebody's talking. So the radios totally shut off. There's no buzz in your ear. You don't hear anything. The backpack was very quiet. And so there you are, complete silence. And I'm just looking around, and it's like, let this come in. Okay? And I started to say back in the beginning, you know, I have a sort of philosophical bent anyway. And so historically, you know, I was well aware in a sort of academic way of the historic nature of what we're doing. But unexpected to me, as I'm just swinging around and letting all this come in, my job I saw then was to be a human sponge, to just absorb it. I wasn't going to try to analyze, just let it come in, process later, you know. So I'm just taking this in, and all of these questions start just flooding in, you know. How did you get here? Why are you here? What does this mean? What's going on? And not in the sense of I got here on a Saturn V, you know. I mean, that's not the deal. I'm here, and this wasn't what I thought right then. It was the questions came in. It took me like 5 years afterward to really go through and think about the answers to these things. But, I mean, I'm here because of this incredible marriage between humanity and our machines, which has allowed us to extend our capability as humans to explore, which is somehow built into us. I'm really here as a representative of all of humanity, in fact, all of Earth life, on this frontier as we're beginning to move out into the cosmos. And this is not just the American taxpayers. This is life. This is everybody. And I'm simply here on this frontier as the sensing element of humanity, of life, of Earth life moving out. 5 minutes is up. Couldn't fix the camera. Okay, Rusty, you know, we got to get back in now. Well, okay, back to, you know, move up the handrail quickly, go back in the door, etc. EVA is over and back to reality. That's what it was.
Just a few months later, man sets foot on the moon, July of 1969. What's it like to know, as you're watching that you've been a major contributor to that process?
I think people's reactions are unique to them. Obviously, a lot of commonality, but I think all of us were very aware, very much aware, that we were incredibly privileged to take part in a truly historic event. I think there's no question about that. Again, as I say, individuals react differently and put it in a different context. The context that I see now is a bit different and larger than it was right after and during the events. In some ways, while that first landing on the moon was truly unique and absolutely the epitome. My own personal sense, without taking anything away from Apollo 11, was that Apollo 8 was really the more historically significant moment, in the sense that the Apollo 8 crew were the first who literally had moved out the birth canal of Mother Earth out into the cosmos. They were the first participants actively in what I have come to call cosmic birth. And they looked back from around the moon and saw the Earth from outside its gravitational sphere of influence. They are the first people who represented Earth life moving out from the birthplace of life in our little corner of the universe. That's what we are. We are part of this incredible experiment of the universe, which from the very beginning has led to, probably dispersed all through the universe, examples of life, complexity developing, self-organization, et cetera, resulting in life, which was built into the blueprint somehow of the universe. We don't understand how, but it's impossible to think that we're unique. But we are the representative of that great experiment here. And we are at that magic moment in history where, again, in combination with the machines that we've created, technology and science, we're now moving out, being born as life into the cosmos. And that is what Apollo was all about. And in my mind, that's the uniqueness of Apollo 8.